The low clink of silverware and the hum of distant conversation drifted from the dining room as Clara balanced the heavy ceramic casserole in both oven mitts, the warm scent of roasted broccoli and parmesan curling up into her face. It was the third Sunday of October, same as always. Family dinner at the Bennett house, a tradition Ethan's family had kept long before she'd married him. 6 years, she thought, stepping carefully through the doorway. 6 years of showing up early, helping Mabel in the kitchen, remembering everyone's dietary preferences, making sure the table was set just right. 6 years of building this life side by side with him. The table was already full. Ethan's aunt and uncle were bickering gently about their grandson's soccer schedule. Jake was scrolling absently through his phone. And Mabel sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled back neat, a half-empty glass of iced tea in front of her. The chair to Ethan's left, her chair, the one she'd sat in every Sunday for 6 years, the one with the faint scratch on the arm from when she'd dropped a serving spoon their first year, was empty. She set the casserole down on the sideboard for a second to peel off the mitts, ready to slide into her usual spot. When the front door chimed, Ethan stood up first, adjusting the collar of his button-down. "That's probably Jake," he said, but Jake was already right there, lifting an eyebrow. Clara frowned. They weren't expecting anyone else. Family dinner was family only, always had been. She watched Ethan walk toward the foyer, heard the low murmur of his voice, and then another voice, higher, feminine, laughing at something he'd said. When they walked back in, the conversation at the table dimmed just a little. The woman was tall, with long dark hair and a sharp, polished smile, wearing a silk blouse that looked far too nice for a casual Sunday dinner. Ethan kept his hand light on her lower back, a gesture Clara recognized, one he used to use with her at business events, when he wanted people to know they were Everyone. "This is Lila," Ethan said, nodding toward her. "She's our new account manager at the office. She just moved to Lake Oswego last week, didn't have any plans for the evening, so I invited her." A quiet ripple went through the table. Mabel's eyes narrowed just slightly. Clara stood frozen by the sideboard, her oven mitt still crumpled in one hand. New account manager? She'd gone over all the new hires last month. She'd never heard the name Lila. Before anyone could say anything else, Lila scanned the table, her gaze landing on the empty chair beside. She didn't. She walked straight over, pulled the chair out and sat down, dropping her leather tote over the back of it like she lace. The clink of silverware stopped. Clara felt her breath catch. The heat from the casserole had faded from her hands, but suddenly her face was burning, hot all the way up to the tips of her ears. She stared at the back of Lila's head, at the way she'd already reached for a glass, like this was perfect. She looked at Eating, waiting for him to laugh it off, to say, "Whoops, wrong seat, that's Clara's chair," waiting for him to defend her in front of people. Ethan looked at her. He just pulled out the chair on the other side of the table, the one by the kitchen door, the extra seat they pulled out when there were guests, and it. "Clara," he said, his voice flat, like he was asking her to and sit there. For a second she thought she might casserole. The room too small, too quiet, like everyone was in their breath, waiting to stew. 6 years. 6 years of late nights in the garage, wrapping up client proposals when she could barely open. 6 years of skipping girls' trips and birthday dinners because he had a deadline. 6 years of loving him through every failure and every win, believing they were a team. And now, in front of his entire family, he was letting another woman sit in her chair and her to move. She opened her mouth. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His aunt made a small, awkward coughing sound. Word. Then made glass down. It wasn't loud, not really, just the soft thud of glanced oak wood. But it cut through this knife. Everyone's eyes turned to the table. The old woman very still, her gaze fixed on Lila, her mouth set in a line. "Young lady," she said, her voice steady, low enough that everyone had to lean in a little to hear. "That seat is taken." Lila turned, her smile still in place, sweet and at the same time. She glanced at Ethan, then back at Mabel. "Oh, I'm sorry. Ethan didn't say there were assigned seats. Figured with family." The word family hung in the air and wrong. Clara's fingers tightened around the oven mitts. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, loud enough she was sure everyone could hear it. She waited for Ethan to correct her. "To say no, you're a guest, that's my wife's seat." He said nothing. He just stared down at his napkin, folding it open in his lap. Mabel made a small, dry sound to a scoff. She pushed herself up from her chair, slow but steady, her back straight as a rod. She walked around the table, one slow step at a time, until she was standing in Lila's chair. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the radiator down the hall. Lila tilted her chin up, ready to argue. Like she thought an old woman to her. "You walk into my house," Mabel said. It's cold and clear. "You sit in my granddaughter-in-law's chair, and you dare call yourself family?" The slap came fast, sharp, and loud. It cracked through the firecracker. Lila's head snapped to the side, across her face. She froze, one hand flying up to her chest wide with shock. The red mark was already being bright across her skin. Ethan shot up out of his chair so fast it scraped hard against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and jarring. He stared at his grandmother, his voice tight with disbelief. "Grandma?" The scrape of the chair against hardwood hung in the air, sharp and raw. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes wide, flicking between his grandmother's stony face and Lila's shocked, tear-pricked expression. The handprint bloomed bright pink across Lila's cheek, and she pressed her palm to it like she couldn't believe what had just happened. Her breath came in shaky little gasps, and for a second no one at the table made a sound. "Grandma," Ethan said again, his voice tight with a mix of disbelief and anger. "What is wrong with you?" Mabel didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her shoulders back, and leveled her gaze at Lila like she was staring at a stain on her tablecloth. "You will get out of my house," she said, slow and clear, every word sharp as a tack. "You will take your bag, and you will leave, and you will never set foot in this dining room again. Do you understand me?" Lila's mouth fell open. She looked at Ethan, like she was waiting for him to step in, to defend her, to yell at his grandmother and make it all okay. Ethan's jaw tightened. He reached out, his hand hovering near her elbow like he wanted to pull her up, but he didn't dare meet Mabel's eyes. No one in this family dared cross Mabel when she was like this, not even him. "Ethan," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "Come on," he said low, grabbing her tote from the back of the chair. "I'll walk you out." He didn't look at Clara, not once. He guided Lila toward the front door, his hand firm on her arm, and left the rest of them sitting there in the heavy, awkward silence. The front door clicked shut behind them. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. Clara still stood by the sideboard, the oven mitts crumpled in her hand. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, pitying, uncomfortable, embarrassed. Her face still burned. Her throat felt tight, like she was swallowing glass. 6 years of Sunday dinners, and this was how it ended. Mabel turned to the rest of the table, her voice calmer now, but still. "Dinner's over," he said. "Everyone go home. We'll reschedule." No one argued. They gathered their coats and purses, mumbled awkward goodbyes, and filed out. Jake paused on his way past Clara, opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then shook his head and followed the other. When the house was quiet, Mabel walked over to her. She rested a light hand on her. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "Don't you dare stand there and blame yourself." Clara nodded, but she couldn't. She was afraid if she opened her mouth, she'd start crying, and she didn't want to cry here. Not in this dining room, not where that woman had sat. She drove. The streetlights blurred past the windshield, orange and soft. The hum of the tires on the pavement filled the car. She kept replaying. The way Lila had walked straight chair, the way Ethan had away, the sound of. She'd known something off lately. The late nights, the quiet phone calls, the way he'd started keeping his phone face down on the counter. But she'd told herself it was work stress. She'd told herself they'd been married 6 years, that this was just much. He was home. She heard his keys jingle in the lock, heard his footsteps here. He walked into the living room, his tie loose, his jaw tight, and the first was, "Why didn't you stop her?" Clara stared at the couch. "Stop who? Your grandmother?" "Yes," he said, running through his hair. "That was humiliating, Clara, in front of my whole family. In front of an employee? She's a new hire. I invited her to be nice. Now you and Grandma turned it into a big scene." "A scene?" She stood up, her voice she'd intended. "She sat in my chair, Ethan. My chair. And you said nothing. You just sat there and let her do it, and then you told me to sit at the end of the table. I was the guest." "It's just a chair," he snapped. "It's not that big of a deal. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Lila's a good employee. I don't want her scared off because my family is drama." "Your family?" She laughed, bitter and thin. "I'm your wife, Ethan, or have you forgotten that?" He sighed, loud and frustrated, being unreasonable. Like she was the one who'd messed up. "I don't want to fight about tonight," he said. "Grandma was out of line. You need to talk to her. Apologize to Lila tomorrow at work, and we'll move past it." He turned and walked down the hall to the guest bedroom. The door clicked shut behind him. Clara stood there in the middle of the living room, light warm around her, and felt something cold settle in her chest. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even embarrassed for her. He was embarrassed for himself. She went the next morning anyway. Told herself she wasn't going to hide. This was her company as much as it was his. She'd built it with him, from the ground up, but the office felt different. People glanced at her when she walked in and looked away quickly. The reception had a tight, awkward smile. Clara walked straight to the finance dashboard on her computer. Saw made her blood run cold. Lila Marlowe. Base salary increased by 30%, effective 2 weeks prior. Access granted to the West Coast retail client portfolio. Their biggest account. The one Clara had landed herself. Still working out of a garage. User permissions updated to senior account manager. Even though she'd only been on staff 6 weeks, called Jake into her office. He stood in the way, shifting his weight, and wouldn't meet her eyes. Ethan signed off on it, he said, before she could even ask. Said she was a tar. I didn't have a say. Clara sat back in her chair, her hands cold on the keyboard. Top performer. 6 weeks she left work early. She couldn't sit there another minute, knowing Lila was down the hall, knowing everyone was talking about her. The parking garage was dim, the air thick with exhaust fumes. She walked toward her car, then paused. Ethan's SUV was parked 2 spots over. He'd said he was driving to a client meeting today. Ace was still on the passenger seat. She leaned in, meaning to grab the jumper cables he kept in the glove box. Her car battery had been acting up, and that's when she saw them. Tucked in the side pocket of the center, a stack of receipts. Hotel receipts from downtown Portland, one every 2 weeks going back 6 months. A receipt from a jewelry store in the Pearl District for a diamond pendant necklace, almost $2,000. She'd never gotten a diamond pendant. Her fingers shook as she fumbled the receipts back into place. 6 months. Half a year. He'd been lying to her for a year. She drove home in a daze. The house was dark when she pulled, except for the lamp in the front room. She walked inside, and there was Mabel, sitting on her couch, a manila envelope on the coffee table in front of her. Woman looked up, her eyes steady. We need to talk, she said, about your share of the company. The manila envelope made a soft rustling sound as Mabel slid it across the coffee table. The living room lamp cast warm gold over the paper, and for a long second, Clara just stared at it, her hands folded tight in her lap. Her throat still felt tight from the receipts she'd found in Ethan's car. The dates burned into her memory. 6 months of lies. 6 months of hotel rooms and gifts she'd never seen. Your grandfather left Ethan seed money when we first started out, Mabel said, her voice steady. But that wasn't all of it. You put in $20,000 of your own savings, remember? The money you'd saved from your freelance design work before you got married. You both signed papers. 40% of the company is yours. Not 10, not 5, 40, Clara blinked. She'd signed a lot of papers in those early garage days, half asleep over takeout pizza, trusting Ethan to handle the fine print. He'd told her years later that her share had been diluted when they brought on investors. She'd believed him. She'd never thought to check. She reached out and touched the envelope, her fingers trembling a little. Why are you giving me this now? Because you're going to need it, Mabel said simply. That boy has forgotten who built this with him. He thinks he can push you around, take what's yours, and you'll just sit there and smile like you always do. You've got to stop letting him. Clara looked away, out the dark front window at the quiet suburban street. Part of her still wanted to fix it. 6 years of marriage didn't just disappear overnight. She wanted to sit down with Ian, talk it through, make him see what he was risking. But another part of her, the part that had stood in that dining room and watched another woman sit in her chair, knew there was no going back to the way things. I don't want to fight him, she said quietly. He's already fighting you, Mabel said. He just hasn't told. The old woman left an hour later, after making Clara promise to look over the paper. Clara sat on the couch long after the front door shut, the envelope heavy on the table. She thought about the early days, the garage with the space heater that barely worked, the nights they'd eaten cereal for dinner because they couldn't afford groceries, the way he'd held her hand and said they were in it together. It felt like a different. She went into the office early that morning. The building was still quiet, only the cleaning crew pushing carts. She sat down at her desk, logged into the finance system, and it was worse. Over the past 3 months, Ethan had approved 3 separate vendor payments to a consulting firm she of. The addresses traced back to a P.O. box. The amounts added up to almost $75,000. There were extra expense reports, client entertainment charges that didn't line up with any meeting about, a monthly retainer to a law firm that wasn't their usual counsel. Her fingers hovered. She could feel her heart temples. He wasn't cheating on her. He was siphoning money. Before she could talk out of it, she pulled up Lila's flagship retail client project, the one Ian had handed her, the one with the 6-figure budget, and froze the remaining funds. No more vendor approvals, no more expense reimbursements, no more last-minute budget increases, not until someone showed her paperwork. It was barely an hour later when Ethan stormed office. He slammed the door behind him so hard the framed artwork rattled. What the hell do you think you're doing? He snapped, his face red with anger. You froze Lila's project budget? Are you insane? That client is our biggest account. Your biggest account. Clara leaned back in her chair, her voice than she felt. I led that client, Ethan. I designed their entire brand identity. I drove down to Eugene 3 times in 1 week to close that deal, and you handed it to Give. This is business, he said, taking a step toward her desk. You don't get to throw tantrums because you're mad about dinner. Unfreeze that budget. Now. Or what? She looked up at him, and for the first look away. You'll move me to a smaller office? You'll take my title away? You already did that, remember? Slowly, one thing at a time, until I was just the one who showed up to parties. He laughed, sharp and bitter. You think you're tough? You think those papers Grandma gave you mean something? I can tie this up in court for years. You'll walk away with nothing, and keep the car. The words hung in the air between them, cold and final. Clara felt something inside her snap. All those years of making excuses, of looking the other way, of telling herself he was just stressed, all dissolved right there. She said. He stared at her, like he didn't recognize her. For a second, she thought he might yell louder. Instead, he turned, wrenched the door open, and stormed out. The office went quiet. She sat there long after he was gone, her hands shaking. She'd pushed back, and she knew, deep down, going to get worse. It was almost 9 o'clock that night, when there was a knock on her front door. She opened it to find Jake sitting on her porch, his hood up, glancing over his shoulder. One might see him. Can I come in? He said, his voice low. She let him in. He paced the kitchen once, then stopped, his hands in his pocket, wouldn't meet her eyes. I shouldn't be telling you this, he said. He's my brother, waited. Jake took a breath. He's been planning this for months. The consulting firms, the bank accounts, he's moving money out. He wants to drain as much as he can before you file for divorce, able to prove it. Clara leaned back against the kitchen counter, the cold tile pressing into palms. She'd known it was bad. She hadn't known it was this calculated. His eyes, finally. There were them, and something else. Relief, almost, carrying it too long. Not the guy you married, he said. You need to be ready. The kitchen clock ticked past 10 when Jake finally slipped out the back door, his hood pulled low over his head. Clara leaned against the counter for a long time, staring at the half-empty mug of coffee he'd left behind. For the first time since that dinner, she didn't feel entirely alone. Someone else knew. Someone else was on her side. They met again 2 days later at a quiet coffee shop off the highway, the kind with faded booths and constant low hum of espresso machines. Jake showed up 10 minutes late, sunglasses on, like he was afraid someone from the office would spot them. Clara slid a folder across the table, printouts of the suspicious vendor payments, the salary increases Ethan had pushed through, the notes she'd started keeping on every irregularity she could find. I talked to a friend at a forensic accounting firm, she said, stirring her latte, her voice low. If I can get access to the full general ledger from the last 2 years, we can prove he's moving money out. And I have the Gu Quan papers from Mabel, 40%. He can't just push me out. Jake nodded, flipping through the papers. He leaned in, his voice quiet. He's already talking to his lawyer about a divorce filing. He's planning to say you stepped away from operations years ago, that you're just a spouse with no real claim to the business. If you hit him with the audit before he files, you'll catch him off guard. He gave her a list of internal server folders to pull. Specific date ranges he said would show the clearest paper trail. Clara wrote every word down, grateful. It felt good to have someone who knew the inside of the company on her side. She didn't even think to ask why he was suddenly so willing to go against his own brother. She met Mia for lunch that same afternoon, at their usual spot downtown. Mia was her college roommate, the person who'd helped her paint her first apartment, who'd been her maid of honor, who'd been warning her for over a year that Ethan was pulling away. When Clara told her about Jake, Mia set her sandwich down in front. Wait a second, she said, wiping her hands on a napkin. Jake? The same Jake who's never once stood up to Ethan in his entire life? The guy who let Ethan take credit for his code 3 separate times? Clara sighed. She'd known Mia would say it. He feels guilty. He knows what Ethan is doing. Mia leaned forward, her voice sharp with frustration. He's his brother. Blood wins. You just handed him every single one of your cards. What if he goes straight back to Ethan and tells him everything you're planning? He wouldn't do that. How do you know? Because he showed up at your house looking guilty? Guys like Jake don't pick sides until they know who's going to win. Right now, Ethan still holds all the power. The words stung. Clara felt her defenses go up. So I'm just supposed to trust no one? Do everything by myself? You can trust me, Mia said. But you told him about the audit? About Grandma's papers? That's everything. If Ethan finds out you're building a case against him, he's not going to wait around. He's going to strike first. They argued for another 20 minutes. Clara insisted Mia was being cynical, that not everyone was elves. Mia said Clara was too willing to see the good in people who'd already shown her they didn't deserve it. They left the restaurant angry, Mia heading back to her studio, Clara walking to her car, right. It felt like yet another thing had broken. Her oldest friendship. Fraying at the edges because she couldn't bring herself to admit wrong. She walked into the office at the next morning, ready to pull the server file Jake had mentioned. She sat down at her desk, typed her password into the finance system, and froze. Access denied. She tried again. Same message. She picked up the phone to call IT, but there was a knock on her office door she could dial. It was HR director, her face comfortable. Clara, she said, stepping inside. Ethan called an emergency leadership meeting. He wants everyone in the conference. The room was already full when she walked in. Ethan stood at his arms folded. Lila stood beside him, her cheeks still faintly discolored, but covered with makeup, her posture calm and professional, belonged there. Jake sat in the back row, his eyes fixed on the table. Waste time. Effective immediately, he said, his voice flat. Clara is stepping down from her role as head of finance and administration. She's been going through a difficult personal time, and her judge has been compromised. Last week she froze a critical client budget without approval, putting our loan at risk. A murmur went around the room. Stared at him, stunned. That's not what happened. Those payments? Lila will be taking over the role on an interim basis. He cut her off, like she hadn't spoken. She's already familiar with the client portfolio. HR will work with you to collect your pay at the end of the day. The room went quiet. No one said a word. No one defended her. She looked at Jake. Half a second their eyes met. Then he looked away. She understood then. Mia had been... She didn't make a scene. She packed her desk in silence, carried her car, and drove home. She didn't cry and closed the front door behind her. She tried to go back the next morning, to grab a few files she'd forgotten. Anyone. But her didn't work at the front door. The security guard stepped forward, polite but firm, and told her she wasn't authorized on the premises without a schedule. Mr. Bennett. She stood there in the glass lobby, peeking past her on their way to work, and felt small, humiliated. She'd built this place. She'd designed the logo, signed the first lease, interviewed the first 3 employees, and now even allowed through the front door. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She fished it out, her vision blurry. Mabel's name lit up the screen. She answered, her voice thick. Grandma? The old woman's voice was steady, sharp as a blade. Come to my house, she said. I have something to show you. Something he's been terrified you'd find out. The rain streaked down the windshield as Clara turned onto Mabel's street, the old oak trees lining the sidewalk heavy with wet autumn leaves. It was the kind of gray, drizzly Portland day that felt like it would never end, and she'd been replaying the lobby scene in her head on the drive over. The security guard's polite, unyielding face, the way her keycard had blinked red, like it didn't even recognize her anymore. She pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and sat there for a minute, just listening to the rain tap against the roof. She felt raw, stretched thin, like one more bad thing might break her entirely. But when she walked up the porch steps and Mabel opened the door, the old woman didn't say, I'm sorry. She just stepped aside and said, Come in. I made tea. The house smelled like cinnamon and old books, same as it always had. Mabel led her down the hall to the study, the room where Grandpa Bennett had kept his desk, where all the family papers were stored in heavy oak filing cabinets. The desk lamp was on, casting warm light over a stack of documents held together with a brass paperclip. Mabel pulled out a chair for her. This is the original operating agreement from when you started the company, she said, pushing the papers across the desk. 2018. You and Ethan both signed it. 40% membership interest to you, 60% to him. That was the deal. Clara's fingers hesitated before she touched the paper. She recognized her own signature, scrawled at the bottom, the same messy handwriting she'd had since college. She remembered that day. They'd signed it on the folding table in their garage, the space heater humming beside them, a half-eaten pizza on the floor. Ethan had told her it was just paperwork, that it didn't really matter because they were married. What was his was hers. She'd believed. 3 years ago, Mabel said, sitting down across from her. He came to... wanted me to sign off on a new agreement. Said you'd agreed to dilute your shares down to 5% to make room for investors. I told him I'd need to hear it from you. He never brought it up. Clara looked up, her throat tight. He told me the dilution already happened. He said I didn't have a Mabel's voice was flat, no anger in it. Just plain fact. You can't dilute a member's interest in an LLC without their signature. He never filed the updated paperwork. Not legally. 40% is still yours. Every cent of it. The room went quiet, save for the rain against the window. Clara stared at the signature on the page. 6 years. 6 years of being slowly pushed out, of being told she was lucky to have what he gave her, of shrinking herself smaller and smaller to fit the role he'd made for her. And all along, she'd owned almost half the company. He'd just pretend. Mabel slid a second, thinner folder across the desk. I had my attorney look to the woman. Lila Marlowe. Clara blinked. You looked her up? I'm old, Clara. I'm not stupid. A woman shows up out of nowhere, sits in your chair at my dinner table. I wanted to know who she was. Mabel tapped the folder. Last job was at a marketing firm in Seattle. Worked there 8 months. Left very suddenly. Signed a non-disclosure and a separation agreement. The CEO at the time was married. His wife filed for divorce 3 months after Lila quit. Named her in the filings. Clara opened the folder. There were redacted court records, employment dates, a copy of a separation agreement with a blank dollar amount. She felt cold, all down to her bones. This wasn't some random office fling. Lila had done this before. She knew exactly what she was doing. And Ethan, so convinced he was in control, so sure he was just having a little fun, walked right into it. For a sec to laugh. Thought he was the smart one. He thought he was smarting everyone. She pulled her slowly. All the hurt, all the humiliation, all the anger she'd been carrying since that dinner suddenly settled into something steady. There's no more room for hoping. No more room for excuses. He'd made a choice a long time ago. She had to make hers. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the number of the divorce attorney Mead recommended weeks ago. The one she but never called. She looked up at Mabel. I want to file, she said, and I want to call a shareholders meeting. If I own 40%, I have him as CEO. Mabel nodded, like she'd been waiting for her to say it. Good. Clara stepped out into the hallway to make the call. The lawyer's office said they could get her in first thing tomorrow morning. She hung up, leaned her forehead against the cool wall, and breathed. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt like starting to swim. She was halfway when her phone buzzed again. It was the attorney's office calling back. She answered, assuming they were confirming the appointment. Ms. Bennett? The voice on the was serious, cautious. I just got notice from the county clerk. Your husband filed for divorce this afternoon. His filing states you have no ownership interest in Bennett Digital. He claims you left the company 5 years ago and have no legal claim to business assets. He's also requesting a family home. Clara pulled over to the side of the road, her hand tight around the steering wheel. The rain beat harder against the windows. She looked down at the passenger seat, where the original operating in its manila envelope. He'd struck first. Thought she'd have nothing to fight with. He'd planned this all along, kicking her out of the office, spreading the story that she'd walked away years ago, building his version of the chance to speak. She thought about the garage, the pizza boxes, the way he'd held her hand and said they'd always be a team. She thought about Lila sitting in her dining room chair, and Ethan looking away. She thought about all the years she'd apologized first, all the times she'd told herself he was just stressed, all the made herself smaller to keep, not anymore. She took a slow, deep breath. Her hands didn't shake anymore. Okay, she said, her voice steady and calm. Then we'll just have to prove him wrong. The conference room at the law firm smelled like fresh coffee and leather-bound notebooks, but Clara couldn't focus on any of it. Her lawyer, Diane, sat across from her, tapping a finger against the stack of court filings Ethan's team had submitted overnight. The words non-participating spouse and minimal contribution jumped off the page at her, sharp and ugly. His team is already talking to anyone who'll listen, Diane said, her voice steady. Family, industry contacts, people you both do business with. They're framing this as you walking away from the marriage and the company years ago, and now coming after his hard-earned success because you're bitter. It's a narrative play. They want public opinion on his side before we even get to mediation. Clara stared down at her hands. She'd known Ethan would fight dirty. She just hadn't realized how far he'd go. It got worse as the week went on. She texted Jake twice, asking if they could talk, if he'd be willing to testify about her role in the early days. Both times he replied with vague one-line answers. Sorry, swamped with work. This is really between you and him. She got the message. He was picking his brother. She ran into Ethan's Aunt Linda at the grocery store 3 days later, reaching for the same carton of orange juice. Linda's smile tightened when she saw her. She pulled her hand back like the carton had burned her. I really thought you were better than this, Linda said, her voice low, like she was disappointed. All these years we welcomed you into this family. And now you're trying to take everything from him? After everything he's given you? Clara stood there in the middle of the produce aisle, other shoppers pushing their carts past, and couldn't find a single word to say. Linda walked away without another glance. By the time Clara got to the checkout line, her face was burned. She could feel people looking at her, whispering. She didn't know if they actually were, or if she was just so humiliated she imagined. When she got home, she opened the family group chat to see 50 new messages. Everyone was weighing in. Most of them took Ethan's. They talked about how hard he'd worked, how he'd built the company from nothing, how Clara should be grateful for the life she... No one mentioned the garage days. No one mentioned her client needs. her savings that kept the lights on during the first year. No one seemed to remember she'd been there from... She scrolled to Mia's contact in her phone, thumb hovering over the... They hadn't spoken since their fight at the K. Clara hated that she'd pushed her best friend away, hated that she'd been too stubborn to admit Mia was right about... But pride... She couldn't bring herself to die. She tossed her phone onto the couch and stared at the ceiling, feeling more alone than she ever had at night. She went down to the basement storage room looking for old tax returns. Diane had asked for every financial record she could find from the first 3 years of the company. The boxes were stacked against the back wall, dusty. She pulled down the one labeled Garage Stuff 2018-2019 and blew dust off the top. The cardboard was soft with age. Inside, underneath old hoodies and a broken space heater, a thick black binder full of printed design drafts, client contracts with her signature scrawled bottom, bank deposit slips from her personal savings into the cut. At the very bottom, wrapped in bubble wrap, was an old external drive. She carried it upstairs and plugged it into the drive. Whirred to life, and creaky. Folders popped up one by one. Brand assets, client proposals, businessman drafts. Every single one of them her work. There were email threads from Ethan, dated 2018, telling her none of this would exist without her, that 40% was the least she deserved. There were versions of the operating agreement with both their notes in the margins, long before they ever signed. She sat there for hours, clicking through file. The humiliation and the hurt didn't go away, but something else settled in underneath it, something sharp and sure. He'd counted on having proof. He'd count on her folding, on her being too to fight, on everyone believing his version of the story wrong. The next morning, she walked into Diane's office with the binder and the hard drive and set them both on the desk. She didn't make it anymore. Sad. Diane flipped through the binder, lifting. This is good. This is really good, Clara nodded. She sat up straight, her voice calm and even. He wants to play dirty, she said. Fine, let's play. The soft tap of Clara's keyboard filled the spare bedroom she'd turned into a temporary workspace. The glow of her laptop lighting up stacks of printed client files and the old hard drive sitting beside her mug of cold coffee. It had been 3 days since she'd walked into Diane's office with her binder full of proof, and she wasn't wasting any time waiting for the courts to move. She had a list of 12 original clients, companies she'd personally signed, brands she'd built from scratch, CEOs who'd hired Bennett Digital because they trusted her design eye and her work ethic. Ethan had taken them for granted for years. He'd assumed they'd stay just because the company name was on the door. He was wrong. She worked her way down the list one by one, her voice steady and professional. She didn't badmouth Ethan. She didn't spill drama. She just told them the truth. She was no longer with the company. She was in the middle of a legal dispute over ownership, and she wanted to give them a heads up that their accounts might be handed off to new staff. Almost every single one of them paused, then said some version of the same thing. If you're not running the account, we're not sure we want to stay. By the end of the week, 4 of the top 5 clients had called Ethan's office asking to renegotiate their contracts. 2 put their upcoming projects on hold until they had clarity on who was actually running the company. Ethan felt it immediately. He stormed into Lila's office Monday morning, slamming a stack of client emails down on her desk, his face tight with frustration. What is going on? He said. West Coast Retail just pulled their Q4 budget. The brewery called yesterday asking for Clara. People are bailing left and right. Lila blinked, taken aback. She'd thought once Clara was gone, everything would fall into place. She'd thought she'd step in, impress everyone, and Ethan would finally start talking about a future together. But all she'd gotten was more work, more pressure, and clients who kept asking for the woman she'd replaced. I don't know, she said, shifting in her chair. They keep saying they like the old process, but Ethan ran a hand through his hair, jaw tight. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd thought Clara would fold. He'd thought she'd take a small settlement and walk away, embarrassed and instead she was out there, quietly pulling the rug out from under him, client by client. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long... He left the office early that afternoon, saying he had a meeting with his... Lila stayed late, catching up on the pile of work he'd done. Around 7, she walked down the hall to his office to drop off a signed contract. The door was cracked open, his laptop open on the desk, an email thread pulled up on the... She should look. She thought. But curiosity pulled toward. It was a thread between Ethan and his divorce. The most recent message sent that morning. Don't worry about Lila, it read. She's used right now. But once the divorce is final, we'll offer her a small severance and let her go. She has no real leverage. Take it. Lila stood there, the contract crumpling in hand. All those months. All the nights. All the times he'd told her his marriage was dead and he was going to leave her. Every time he'd let her think she was special, that she was going to be the one who got the ring, and the house, and the life. It had all been a lie. She was just a pawn, a tool to make Clara miserable, to make himself feel powerful. And once he was done with her, he'd throw her away like nothing before. Back in Seattle, same story, same promises, same quiet dismissal at the end. She'd sworn to herself she'd never let a man do again. She walked back to her desk, her hand little. She sat down, pulled out her phone, and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd saved months ago, Ace. Clara's personal cell. She stared at it for a long time. She hated Clara, wanted her gone. But she being used more. And she had something Clara wanted. Every internal email, every budget adjustment, every off-the-books payment Eve approved. She had access to all of it. She typed out a message, low and deliberate. I have every document you need to prove he's been moving company money. All of it. I'll give it to you. I just want one thing. I get to keep my job. You run the company. I stay on as account manager. No hard feelings, and... Across town, Clara was sitting at her kitchen table going through bank statements when her phone buzzed beside her. She picked it up, glanced at the unknown number, and read the message once, then twice. She leaned back in her chair, the corner of her mouth tugging up into a coil. Aim was changing. The rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown coffee shop, the low rumble of streetcars drifting through the glass every few minutes. Clara sat in a back booth, a paper cup of black coffee growing cold in front of her, watching the front door. She'd arrived 10 minutes early, her lawyer's voice still ringing in her ears. Be careful. You don't know what she's after. The bell above the door jingled. Lila stepped inside, rain dotted on her wool coat, her hair pulled back tight. She spotted Clara immediately, hesitated for half a second, then walked over and slid into the booth across from her. She didn't order anything. She just set a small silver USB drive on the table between them and pushed it forward with one finger. Everything's on here, she said, her voice flat. No drama, no tears. Every wire transfer to those fake consulting firms, every expense report he fudged, every email between him and his lawyer about hiding assets, even the server logs he told IT to delete. I kept copies. I always keep copies. Clara stared at the drive. It was smaller than her thumb, and it held everything she'd been fighting for. Why are you giving me this? Lila laughed, sharp and bitter. Because he told his lawyer he'd fire me the second the divorce was final. Severance package, goodbye, no hard feelings. 6 months of my life, all the late nights, all the lies I told myself, and I'm just a line item in his exit plan. I've been played before. I don't do it twice. Clara nodded. She'd read Mabel's file. She knew about Seal. You said you want to keep your job. I'm good at what I do, Lila said, leaning forward slightly. You know it. The clients know it. I don't want your husband. I don't want your life. I want a career. If you take over the company, I stay on as account manager. I report to you. No special treatment. No back doors. I do my work. I get paid. And... Clara picked up the drive, turning it over between her fingers. If I find out you're holding anything back, if you try to cut corners, you're gone. No second chances. Fair enough, Lila said. She stood up, adjusted coat. He thinks he's already won. He has no idea what's coming. She left without another word. The bell jingled again, and the boot. Clara sat there for a long time, the drive warm in her palm. She'd spent months feeling like she was always one step behind, always reacting to whatever. For the first time, she was the one who... She met Diane at the law for afternoon. The lawyer plugged the drive into her laptop, scrolling through file after file, her eyebrows lifting higher. Click. This is airtight, she said, only looking up. Embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, fraud on corporate records. He doesn't just lose the CEO spot. He could be personally liable for every... Clara leaned back in her chair. Good. Then let's... There were 3 minority investors besides Mabel, 2 old friends of her grandfather's, plus a small venture firm that had come on board prior. Clara called each one personally, walked them through the evidence, and asked for an meeting. All 3 agreed. Mabel added her vote, and just like them. 2 days later, there was a soft knock on her front door. She opened it to find Jake standing on the porch, his hands in his jacket pockets, his guilt. He'd been on her for weeks. In her eyes. Owe you an apology, he said, before she could speak. I knew what he was doing. I looked the other way because he's my brother. I thought if I stayed out of it, it would just go away. I was wrong. He held out a second USB drive. Server access logs. The ones he told me to wipe last month. I backed them up first. I didn't know why at the time, I just knew it was wrong. Clara stared at him. She thought about the coffee shop. About me not to trust him. Didn't know if she could. But the evidence was real. Why are you doing this now? Because he's destroying the company we built. Jed. his voice rough. Grandpa would be rolling in his grave. This isn't what we started it for. You deserve better. We all do. Took the drive. Thank you. But if you're here to play both sides, I'm not. Shaking his head. I'm done picking sides based on blood. I'm picking what's right. The emergency board meeting was held Friday morning, in the same glass-walled conference room where Ethan had fired her 3 weeks prior. Clara walked in 10 minutes early, Diane and Jake. The 3 minority shareholders sat at the far end of the table, quiet and serious. Ethan walked in 5 minutes late, Lila behind him like an assistant. Smiling, confident, like he thought this was just another formality he could talk his way out of. He pulled out the head chair like he still owned the room. All right, he said, leaning back. What's all this about? Some last-minute drama before mediation? No one answered. Clara slid a stack of printed reports across the table, 1 copy for every shareholder. These are bank records, email threads, and server logs proving you've siphoned over $200,000 out of this company into fake vent over the past 18 months. You used company funds for personal gifts, hotel stays, and legal fees related to your divorce. Ethan's smile faded. He read the papers, his jaw tightening. This is nonsense. Legitimate business expenses. Legit, you deleted the server logs? Jake said, speaking up from the end of the table. Ethan's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with shock. The conference room door opened. Mabel stepped inside, tapping softly against the carpet. She walked slowly to the head of the table, and Ethan stood up, like he was caught with his hand in the key jar. Grandma, he said, his voice tight. You don't need to be here for this. I put the first $50,000 into this company. Her voice sharp and clear. I have every right to be here. You have disgraced this family, and you have stolen from the people who trusted you. You are not fit to run this company. The vote took 10 minutes. 4 votes in favor of immediate suspension. Clara and the 2 outside shareholders. 1 against. Jake stained, his eyes on the table. It was over. Ethan sat there for a long second, red with rage and humiliation. He stood up, knocking his chair back hard. He didn't say a word to Clara. He just stormed out the door, slamming shut behind him. Clara looked around the table. Everyone was watching her. She drew a breath and up a little straighter. All right, she said. Let's talk about next steps. Down in the parking garage, he jammed his car door so hard the frame rattled. He felt for his phone, his hands shaking with anger, and dialed a number saved weeks ago. Just in someone picked up on the other end. Change of plans, Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. We move forward with the countersuit tomorrow. She wants a fight? I'll give her one she'll never forget. The constant hum of fluorescent lights hung flat over the 9th floor mediation suite, the air cool and still, with the faint, distant clack of footsteps down the linoleum hallway. Clara sat straight in her padded vinyl chair, fingers resting light on the manila folder in front of her, its edge worn soft from being opened and closed a dozen times that morning. Beside her, Diane flipped silently through the tabbed exhibit binder, pen tapping once against the operating agreement tab. No nervous chatter, no small talk. They'd gone over every line of this 100 times. Her wool coat was folded neat over the back of her chair, still cool from the walk from the parking garage. Under the table, the old black external hard drive sat heavy in her purse, a solid, unshakable weight. She didn't need it, not really. They had printed, authenticated copies of every record, but she'd brought it anyway, a quiet reminder of the girl she'd been. Back when all of this fit on a folding table in a drafty garage. The door clicked open. Ethan walked in first. Crisp charcoal suit, shoes polished so bright they caught the overhead glow. His jaw was set tight, the way it always got before a meeting he thought he could win. His lawyer trailed half a step behind, leather briefcase thudding softly when he set it on the table. Ethan didn't glance in Clara's direction. He pulled out the far chair, adjusted his cuffs, and nodded once at Eleanor, the silver-haired mediator with a face that had seen every kind of marriage fall out. Eleanor walked through the opening formalities slow and even, her voice neutral as water. Ground rule. Confidentiality, resolution over victory. When she finished, she tilted her head toward Ethan's counsel. Mr. Henderson, your client's opening position, please. Henderson leaned forward, hands folded, tone smooth and reasonable, like he was offering a gift no sensible person could refuse. Thank you. Our position is straightforward. Mr. Bennett founded Bennett Digital in 2018, growing it from a solo home operation to a 20-person firm with 7-figure annual revenue. Ms. Bennett contributed some early freelance design work, but chose to step back from full-time employment 5 years ago to focus on the household. She has held no active operational role in years. He flipped a notebook page. Given the marriage length and shared lifestyle, Mr. Bennett offers a one-time equitable distribution payment of $75,000, plus 24 months of transitional spousal support at $3,000 per month. He believes this is more than generous, and and lets Ms. Bennet establish herself independently without drawn-out litigation. Clara's thumb pressed hard into the folder edge. 75,000. For 6 years of late nights, skipped holidays, every dollar an hour she'd poured into something they were supposed to share. He'd priced her whole life like a used auto. Diane did. She slid the first tabbed exhibit across the table, slow and... Exhibit A, Original LLC Operating Agreement, executed March 12, 2010. Both. Ms. Bennet holds 40% membership interest as a found partner. It was never diluted, never amended, never... Mr. Bennet told his wife shares had been adjusted for investors. That was a lie. No amended filing was ever submitted to state. She pushed forward the next stack, paper rustling soft in the quiet room. Exhibits B through F bank records, payroll ledgers, client contracts, and over 400 email threads proving Ms. Bennet remained actively involved through earlier. She didn't step back. She was reassigned, sidelined, and locked out of the building 3 weeks ago. Was by her. Her voice was steady, sharp, calm, as she laid out the final stack. Exhibits G through K, recovered server logs, vendor invoices, and internal correspondence proving Mr. Bennet diverted roughly $212,000 in corporate funds to shell consulting entities over its. Those funds paid for personal travel, luxury gifts, hotel stays, and retainer fees for this divorce. Under Oregon LLC law, that is clear breach of fiduciary duty. We could pursue triple damages in court. We are here to settle, but not for $70,000. Henderson's jaw tightened. He flipped fast through the server logs, leaning over to murmur low in Ethan's ear. Ethan's face had flushed steadily red as Diane spoke, knuckles white where he ledged. He'd been so sure she wouldn't have proof, so she'd fold. This is absurd, he snapped, before his lawyer could stop him, voice sharp enough that Eleanor raised an eyebrow. He lowered it slightly, anger still thick in every word. You're digging up years-old receipts and blowing them out of proportion. You're bitter. You never cared about spreadsheets or server logs before. You cared about the house, the Hawaii trips, telling people you were married to the CEO. You loved the life I gave you, until you decided to throw it all away to punish me. The room went quiet. Henderson sighed softly and closed his notebook for a second, looked at him. Really looked at him. The crease of frustration in his forehead. The way he still, even now, couldn't see past the truth. For half a second she felt a faint sadness. Not for him, but for the boy in the garage with a laptop and a dream, who'd told her she was the best ever met. That boy was gone. On a long time. She leaned forward slightly, low and even. No yelling, no tears. Just plain truth. I was there the day we picked up that second-hand desk from a guy on Craigslist. I cashed out every dollar in my freelance savings. $20,000, all of it. To pay the first 3 months' garage rent and buy 2 laptops. I designed every logo, every brand guide, every website for our first 20 clients. I stayed up until 3 a.m., reworking that Hood River Brewery label 7 times in 1 week. Because you said land would put us on the map. I missed my sister's wedding because you swore we couldn't miss that launch deadline. I took was more important. She paused, letting the words settle. I didn't do it for the trips. I didn't do it for a title. I did it because you told me we were a team. Because I believed you when you said what was yours was mine. Then little by little you took my clients, my desk, my seat at the table, and told yourself you'd earned every bit of it. You told yourself I was just the wife who stayed home and planned dinner parties. You forgot who built this with you. Ethan said nothing. His jaw was so tight she could see the muscle jump under his skin. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Henderson leaned over and murmured something low, and Ethan gave a sharp nod. The next hour moved slow, numbers creeping back and forth, contracted one by one. Henderson countered first with $100,000 and 5% equity. Diane rejected it flat, twice. Eleanor called for short caucuses, each side stepping into separate rooms to talk strategy. Disposable coffee mugs went cold. The pale gray October light faded a little outside, visible only by the brighter seeping under the door. They finally landed on terms. Eleanor read them aloud, slow, so there was no mistake. Clara would retain her full 40% ownership and assume permanent CEO duties, effective immediately. Ethan would resign that day, surrender 10% of his shares to cover misappropriated funds, and sell his remaining 50% back on a 5-year payout. The Lake Oswego house would list within 30 days, net proceeds split evenly, no spousal support, no petty non-disparagement clauses beyond standard confidentiality, clean, final. Handed the paperwork across the table. Ethan picked up the pen first, holding it above the signature line for a long beat, like he was waiting for someone to stop him. Then he pressed the tip to the paper, signing hard enough that ink bled through to the sheet below. He dropped the pen like it burned him and leaned, eyes fixed on the wall. Clara signed next, slow, steady. When she finished, used the pen and set it down gently. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like closing a book she'd been reading for 6 years and finally standing up to walk away. They filed out one by one. Eleanor said she'd file paperwork with the court by week's end. Henderson shook Diane's hand, formal and professional. Ethan kept walking, shoes clicking fast toward the elevators. Clara took the stairs. She wanted the air. She pushed through the heavy ground floor glass doors, and cool autumn wind hit her face, sharp with rain and fallen leaves. Wet red and orange maple leaves stuck to the concrete sidewalk. She stood there a minute, just breathing. It was over. 6 years of marriage, fighting, and it was over. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Fast at first, then slowing. She turned. Ethan stood a few feet away, tie loose around his neck, hair messy from running a hand through. He looked smaller than inside. Tired, like all the anger had drained out of him. Leaving nothing behind. Clara, he said, voice rough, almost quiet. He paused, like he was searching for words, anything he could say that would change any of it. Is there really no going back? The crinkle of the apple crisp foil wrapper filled Clara's car as she turned onto Maple Street, oak leaves skittering across the asphalt in the October dusk. It was the third Sunday of the month, same as always. 1 year to the day since Lila Marlowe had walked through that front door and sat down in her chair. She parked at the curb, turned off the engine and sat for a beat, listening to the soft tick of the cooling radiator. A year ago, she'd driven away from this same driveway shaking, her face burning, convinced her whole life was unraveling at the seams. Today she felt steady, calm, like she finally knew exactly who she was and where she was going. She grabbed the foil pan from the passenger seat. She'd baked the crisp that morning, the recipe Mabel had walked her through their first year of marriage, and walked up the porch steps. The door swung open before she could even reach for the bell. About time, Mabel said, stepping aside to let her in. Silver hair pulled back neat, a faded floral apron tied around her waist. She looked exactly the same as she always had. Everyone else is already here. Jake brought that hoppy beer he swears everyone likes. Clara laughed, stepping across the familiar threshold. The house smelled the same too. Roast chicken, garlic bread, a hint of cinnamon from the spice cabinet. Like nothing had changed, and like absolutely everything had. She walked into the dining room and paused. The table was set the way it always was. Good china out, cloth napkins folded crisp. The chair to the left of the head of the table, her chair, the one with the faint scratch on the arm from a dropped serving spoon, 6 years prior, was empty, waiting for her. No one else had sat there. No one else would dare. Jake looked up from laying out silverware and grinned. Hey boss, saved you the good She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. In the 12 months since the mediation, Jake had stepped into the technical director role, running the engineering team while she handled business strategy and creative direction. They worked well together, better than they ever had when Ethan called all the shots. Bennett Digital was growing in. New clients signing on every month. The office lighter, healthier, no more secrets. No more unearned favor. Lila had quit 3 months after Clara took her. She'd handed in a formal resignation on a Monday morning. Professional and polite. No drama, no... She'd taken a senior account role at a firm in Seattle, same city she'd come. Clara had wished her well into it. There was no point holding this. They'd both been played, in their... The rest of the family filtered in slowly. Cousins, aunts, uncles. The same faces that had been around that table the night everything. No one mentioned Lila. No one brought up the divorce. It was like the whole messy chapter had faded into the background. Just another family story no one aired at Sunday dinner. They talked about youth soccer games, and new roof installations, and the endless rainy winter ahead. Same. Halfway through the mid-course, the front door opened. The table went quiet, just for a heartbeat. Clara didn't even look up her plate. She knew it was. Ethan stepped into the dining room, a worn jacket slung. Tired. Thinner, almost. The sharp edge of his old confidant. Jake had said he'd taken a regional sales job at a bigger marketing firm across town. It paid well enough, but he wasn't the boss anymore. He had someone now. Hey, he said, glancing around the table, his gaze skimming past Clara first, then coming back. Grandma, I just swung by to grab Grandpa's old toolbox. I'm moving to a new one this week. Mabel nodded toward the hallway. Basement closet, top shelf. You need the step stool. He nodded, and his eyes met Clara's fully, for the first time in months. For a second, neither anything. Then he gave her a tight nod. Clara, you look good, thanks, she said, calm and even. You too. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the whole truth either. It was just polite. The kind of thing you say to someone you used to know well. He turned and walked down the hall, his footsteps on hardwood. The table picked back up conversation like nothing had happened, easy and natural. No one stared. No one whispered. It was just normal. After dinner, Clara helped Mabel clear the plates, stacking them in the kitchen sink. Warm water ran over her hands, the soft clink of ceramic filling the room. Mabel dried a platter with a linen tea towel for a long minute. "You know," she said finally, "that night, I would break you. I sat here at one left and I thought, that could come back from that." Clara smiled, a dinner plate. "I did too for a little while, but it didn't. No." She in the drying rack. "It made me remember who I was. Before the company, before the marriage. Before I started shrinking myself to fit into someone else's idea of what my life should be." Mabel nodded. She set the towel down and rested a hand on Clara's arm. "Your grandpa would be so proud of you. You didn't just take back what was yours. You built something honest." Clara felt her throat tighten, just a little. She blinked and kept smiling. "Thanks, Grandma." She left a little while later, Mabel pressing 2 Tupperware containers into her arms, one full of leftover chicken and mashed potatoes, the apple crisp. "For the week," she said, "and don't work through the weekend. You hear me?" "I hear," Clara promised. She walked out to her car, the cool night air sharp on her cheeks, the first faint stars pricking through the dark over the rooftops. She set the Tupperware on the passenger seat and turned the key. The engine purred soft and steady, away from the curb slowly. She glanced in the rearview mirror just once, with the glowing porch light. The same house where he'd stood frozen and humiliated exactly 1 year before. It looked smaller now from the street, like it belonged to a different life. Once on the center console. She glanced down at the screen, an email from a boutique outdoor apparel he'd been pitching for months. They loved her proposal. They wanted to move forward with a full design. They wanted her. She smiled and looked back at the road ahead. The streetlights stretched out in front of her, warm and golden, the hill and into town. She didn't look in the mirror again.